Meditations on First Philosophy, etc., etc., by Rene Descartes. Meditation 2. Concerning the nature of the human mind, that it is better known than the body. Yesterday's meditation has thrown me into such doubts that I can no longer ignore them, yet I fail to see how they are to be resolved. It is as if I had suddenly fallen into a deep whirlpool. I am so tossed about that I can neither touch bottom with my foot, nor swim to the top. Nevertheless, I will work my way up, and will once again attempt the same path I entered upon yesterday. I will accomplish this by putting aside everything that admits of the least doubt, as if I had discovered it to be completely false. I will stay on this course until I know something certain, or, if nothing else, until I at least know for certain that nothing is certain. Archimedes sought but one firm and immovable point in order to move the entire earth from one place to another. Just so, great things are also to be hoped for if I succeed in finding just one thing, however slight, that is certain and unshaken. Therefore, I suppose everything I see is false. I believe that none of what my deceitful memory represents ever existed. I have no senses whatsoever. Body, shape, extension, movement, and place are all chimeras. What then will be true? Perhaps just the single fact that nothing is certain. But how do I know that there is not something else, over and above all those things that I have just reviewed, concerning which there is not even the slightest occasion for doubt? Is there not some God, or by whatever name I might call him, who instills these thoughts in me? But why would I think that, since I myself could perhaps be the author of these thoughts? Am I not then at least something? But I have already denied that I have any senses in any body. Still I hesitate, for what follows from this? Am I so tied to a body and to the senses that I cannot exist without them? But I have persuaded myself that there is absolutely nothing, all these images, and generally everything belongs to the nature of the body, could turn out to be nothing but dreams. Once I have realized this, I would seem to be speaking no less foolishly were I to say, I will use my imagination in order to recognize more distinctly who I am, than were I to say, now I am surely awake. Now I surely am awake, and I see something true, but since I do not yet see it clearly enough, I will deliberately fall asleep, so that my dreams might represent it to me more truly and clearly. Thus I realize that none of what I can grasp by means of the imagination pertains to this knowledge that I have of myself. Moreover, I realize that I must be most diligent about withdrawing my mind from these things, so that it can perceive its nature as distinctly as possible. But what then am I? A thing that thinks. What is that? A thing that doubts, understands, affirms, denies, wills, refuses, and that also imagines and senses. Indeed, it is no small matter if all of these things belong to me. But why should they not belong to me? Is it not the very same I, who now doubts almost everything, who nevertheless understands something, who affirms that this one thing is true and denies other things, who desires to know more, who wishes not to be deceived, who imagines many things even against my will, who also notices many things which appear to come from the senses? What is there in all of this that is not every bit as true as the fact that I exist, even if I am always asleep, or even if my Creator makes every effort to mislead me? Which of these things is distinct from my thought? Which of them can be said to be separate from myself? For it is so obvious that it is I who doubt, I who understand, and I who will, that there is nothing by which it could be explained more clearly. But indeed it is also the same I who imagines, for although perhaps, as I had supposed before, absolutely nothing I have imagined is true, still, the very power of imagining really does exist, and constitutes a part of my thought. Finally, it is the same I who senses or who is cognizant of bodily things as if through the senses. For example, I now see a light, I hear a noise, I feel heat. These things are false since I am asleep, yet I certainly do seem to see, hear, and feel warmth. This cannot be false. Properly speaking, this is what in me is called sensing, but this, precisely so taken, is nothing other than me thinking. From these considerations, I am beginning to know a little better what I am. But it still seems, and I cannot resist believing, that corporeal things, whose images are formed by thought, and which the senses themselves examine, are much more distinctly known than this mysterious I, which does not fall within the imagination. And yet It would be strange indeed were I to grasp the very things I consider to be doubtful, unknown, and foreign to me, more distinctly than what is true, what is known, than, in short, myself. But I see what is happening. My mind loves to wander, and does not yet permit itself to be restricted within the confines of truth. So be it then. Let us, just this once, allow it completely free rein, so that, a little while later, when the time has come to pull in the reins, the mind may more readily permit itself to be controlled, having been indulged in this. Let us consider those things which are commonly believed to be the most distinctly grasped of all, namely the bodies we touch and see. Not bodies in general, mind you, for these general perceptions are apt to be somewhat more confused, but one body in particular. Let us take, for example, a piece of wax. It has been taken quite recently from the honeycomb. It has not yet all of the honey flavor. It retains some of the scent of the flowers from which it was collected. Its color, shape, and size are manifest. It is hard and cold. It is easy to touch. If you rap on it with your knuckle, it will emit a sound. In short, everything is present in it that appears needed to enable a body to be known as distinctly as possible. But notice that, as I am speaking, I am bringing it closer to a fire. The remaining traces of the honey flavor are disappearing. The scent is vanishing. The color is changing. The original shape is disappearing. Its size is increasing. It is becoming liquid and hot. You can hardly touch it. And now when I rap on it, it no longer emits any sound. Does the same wax still remain? I must confess that it does. No one denies it. No one thinks otherwise. So what was there in the wax that was so distinctly grasped? Certainly none of the aspects that I reached by means of the senses, for whatever came under the senses of taste, smell, sight, touch, or hearing has now changed, and yet the wax still remains. Perhaps the wax was now what I now think it is, namely that the wax itself was never really the sweetness of the honey, nor the fragrance of the flowers, nor the whiteness, nor the shape, nor the sound, but instead was a body that a short time ago manifested itself to me in those ways, and now does so in other ways. But just what precisely is this thing that I thus imagine? Let us focus our attention on this, and see what remains after we have removed everything that does not belong to the wax, only that it is something extended, flexible, and mutable. But what is it to be flexible and mutable? Is it what my imagination shows it to be, namely that this piece of wax can change from a round to a square shape, or from a square to a triangle shape? Not at all. For I grasp that the wax is capable of innumerable changes of this sort, even though I am incapable of running through these innumerable changes by using my imagination. Therefore, this insight is not achieved by the faculty of imagination. What is it to be extended? Is this thing's extension also unknown? For it becomes greater in wax that is beginning to melt, greater in boiling wax, and greater still as the heat is increased. And I would not judge correctly what the wax is if I did not believe it takes on an even greater variety of dimensions that I could ever grasp with the imagination. It remains then for me to concede that I do not grasp what this wax is through the imagination. Rather, I perceive it through the mind alone. The point I am making refers to this particular piece of wax, for the case of wax in general was clearer still. But what is this piece of wax which is perceived only by the mind? Surely it is the same piece of wax that I see, touch, and imagine. In short, it is the same piece of wax I took it to be from the very beginning. But I need to realize that the perception of the wax is neither a seeing, nor a touching, nor an imagining. Nor has it ever been, even though it previously seemed so. Rather, it is an inspection on the part of the mind alone. This inspection can be imperfect and confused, as it was before, or clear and distinct as it is now, depending on how closely I pay attention to the things in which the piece of wax consists. But meanwhile, I marvel at how prone my mind is to errors. For although I am considering these things within myself silently and without words, nevertheless, I seize upon words themselves, and I am nearly deceived by the ways in which people commonly speak. For we say that we see the wax itself if it is present, and not that we judge it to be present from its color or shape. Whence I might conclude straight away that I know the wax through the vision had by the eye, and not through an inspection on the part of the mind alone. But then, Were I perchance to look out my window and observe men crossing the square, I would ordinarily say, I see the men themselves, just as I say I see the wax. But what do I see aside from hats and clothes which conceal machines? Yet I judge them to be men. Thus what I thought I had seen with my eyes, I actually grasped solely with the faculty of judgment which is in my mind. But a person seeks to know more than the common crowd ought to be ashamed of himself for looking for doubt in common ways of speaking. Let us then go forward and inquire when it was that I perceived more perfectly and evidently what the piece of wax was. Was it when I first saw it, and I believed I knew it by the external sense, or at least by the so-called common sense, that is, the power of imagination? Or do I have more perfect knowledge now, when I have diligently examined both what the wax is and how it is known? Surely it is absurd to be doubted about in this manner. For what was there in my initial perception that was distinct? What was there that any animal seemed incapable of possessing? But indeed, when I distinguish the wax from its external forms, as if stripping it of its clothing, and look at the wax in its nakedness, then, even though there can be still an error in my judgment, nevertheless I cannot perceive it thus without a human mind. But what am I to say about this mind, that is, about myself? For as yet I admit nothing else to be in me over and above the mind. What, I ask, am I who seem to perceive this wax so distinctly? Do I not know myself not only much more truly and with greater certainty, but also much more distinctly and evidently? For if I judge that the wax exists from the fact that I see it, certainly from this same fact that I see the wax it follows much more evidently that I myself exist. For it could happen that what I see is not truly wax. It could happen that I have no eyes with which to see anything. But it is utterly impossible that, while I see, or at least think I see, I do not now distinguish these two, I who think am not something. Likewise, if I judge that the wax exists from the fact that I touch it, the same outcome will again obtain, namely, that I exist. If I judge that the wax exists from the fact that I imagine it, or from any other reason, plainly the same thing follows. But what I note regarding the wax applies to everything else that is external to me. Furthermore, if my perception of the wax seemed more distinct after it became known to me, not only on account of sight or touch, but on account of many reasons, one has to admit how much more distinctly I am now known to myself. For there is not a single consideration that can aid in my perception of the wax, or of any other body that fails to make even more manifest the nature of my mind. But there are still so many other things in the mind itself on the basis which my knowledge can be rendered more distinct, that it hardly seems worth enumerating those things which emanate to it from the body. But lo and behold, I have returned on my own to where I wanted to be. For since I now know that even bodies are not, properly speaking, perceived by the senses, or by the faculty of imagination, but by intellect alone, and that they are not perceived through their being touched or seen, but only through their being understood, I manifestly know that nothing can be perceived more easily and more evidently than my own mind. But since the tendency to hang on to long-held beliefs cannot be put aside so quickly, I want to stop here, so that by the length of my meditation this new knowledge can be more deeply impressed upon my memory. End of Meditation 2.